Out in this cool weather to come down and visit with us a little bit. We're going to get our meeting started just a minute or two early because we're trying to.
New member, I got another one that's filling out an application now.
Thank you, buddy. I'm so always glad to see new members come on board with us. We're going to try to get this thing rolling so we can. The program is actually going to be partly out in the parking lot, so we got a pass to try to get to in what, 20 minutes. We'll stand and do the pledge and get this meeting going. Amen. I'm going to get our program director, Frank, come up here and get us kicked off with this.
Thanks, Mike. Got the camera good? All right, we're gonna do something a little good. You remember there used to be a singer who's passed on, and his daughter was pretty good. He used to do a song called Ayo. All right, when I say do it, I want y'all to let's give a good Ayo. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Ayo. 85. That's what we're going to be watching tonight, okay? Now, tonight, I want you to know we've done something that no one else has ever done. We have out-Malcolmed Malcolm Keon. Now, Malcolm, what he does is anytime anybody around here, whether it's Jackson Club, CMSARA, Scott County, if they have a pretty good program, he hears about it, he gets on the phone, hey, come over here and do that program next month. Well, our guests are in the club with him, and they know exactly what I'm talking about. They gave this program last month over Vicksburg, so now we've got them over here. So we've out-Malcolmed Malcolm this time. We've got two very, very, very well-experienced players in the field of working satellites. Now, I've been giving Eddie Pettis credit for being the former AMSAT journal editor. And, you know, I'd hear some people, that sorry son of a gun wouldn't publish my paper or did whatever. I'm kind of glad I did it that way because it was actually Russ Tillman who was the editor. I promised to correct that in the future. So Russ Tillman and Eddie Pettis, we want to turn it over to them. Now, they've got a pass coming up at 7:28. I'm going to do this to them and start herding cats because I know how slow y'all are to get out there, take a little portable camera, and they're going to show and tell in a really good way. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks a lot, Frank. You had a term there. These guys are real knowledgeable and amateur radio satellites. I'm formally knowledgeable of amateur radio satellites. I got involved in AMSAT, 1994, I think, right when they were starting up the Phase 3D satellite construction program. Got involved in that and got involved in editing the journal and vice president in the organization. And after our Phase 3D experiment, I got experience. I got burned out a little bit and decided I'd watch my daughter grow up. So I got disengaged from being actively in an AMSAT. But as I get closer to retirement now, I'm looking to start rubbing my hands, and my wife's kind of rubbing her hands to worry about me getting involved in satellites. But looking here and seeing the young girl here got me thinking, when I was a little bit younger than her, back in 1961, I think I was in the first grade, and they grabbed all the grade school students, and back then you had an auditorium, you brought them out, and we all got in the auditorium, and up on the stage was this little black and white TV, and Alan Shepard was going into space. Anybody see that launch when they're going up into space there? And I thought that was the coolest thing. Well, lo and behold, amateur radio operators and amateur radio has been involved about that same time and since that same time in spacecraft and doing things in space with amateur radio there. So that's how far we go back there. And I just turned 60 last year, and looking at the pathway there, we've done a lot as hams there associated with that. As Frank mentioned, we got a satellite AO85 that will be coming by. Looks like it's going up the eastern coast of Japan right now. and it's going to make a pass over Brandon starting at 7:28. Eddie's got some pass information that we can give you on this, and we'll explain what it all means a little bit. But at that time, we'll get out in the parking lot here, and with an HT and an arrow antenna, we're going to attempt to make a contact with the satellite and try to talk to another ham, hopefully somewhere in the U.S. The satellite will be coming out of the western coast over our shoulder and headed towards Florida and into the Caribbean there. And this is an online map that you can now call up online and get pass predictions of satellite passes here and stuff. And it's called an EasySat. You can work it with an HT, 5 watts going in there. We're going to do 2 meters up, 440 down on this thing. We're going to transmit on 2 meters, listen on 440 to hear it. So as I ramble on, Frank's going to get involved and tell us when to stop this presentation, and we'll go out and do that. I want to do 5 things with you here. First of all, talk about the history of amateur radio satellites, namely Project Oscar, and now what we have today is called AMSAT. And talk about amateur radio satellites. What are the type of satellites are there that out there? You as an amateur radio operator, what kind of satellites can you work? And then more importantly, how can you work them? We'll cover that. And lastly, what type of resources are out there for you to get involved and get interested in amateur radio satellites if you have that desire to do that. The bottom line is just a personal interest because the information is out there. It's namely getting on the internet and finding it. And there's a wealth of resources out there. Amateur satellites, like other parts of amateur radio, it's wide open to your imagination on what you want to do, what you want to get involved in. There's all types of amateur radio satellite operators. There are people that love to work satellites and make contacts in grid squares and in states that they haven't made contacts in before. As a result, Mississippi's a very, very popular state for that. So when Eddie gets on tonight and says Mississippi, he may get a comeback on there if New Hampshire doesn't shut us out. Okay, the history of amateur radio satellites. Like I said, going back to 1962, I think Alan Shepard went up in April of 1961, so less than a year later, the very first amateur radio satellite went up into orbit. And it got its start kind of uniquely. Out at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, Southern California, they were launching spy satellites into orbit. And this is how much technology's changed associated with this. They would launch these satellites in orbit. These satellites would do reconnaissance filming. They'd re-enter. They would pick up the satellite, develop the film, and that's how they got their information. We've changed a little bit over time. But as they launched these satellites into orbit, they were using the Atlas rocket, and it's got a fixed thrust. And depending on the type of orbit they went on, the satellite, the primary payload, did not weigh enough to compensate the thrust of the launch vehicle to put it in the proper orbit. So they had to put some type of ballast in there. So they were adding sand, water, other type of weight to the payload there in order to achieve the proper orbit. You light the rocket, it burns for a fixed time at a fixed thrust, and the idea is, given the weight of the payload, that's the orbit you get there. So guess what? On these projects working, there were a couple hams, and they said, you know, instead of using sand and water as ballast, why don't we use a good piece of amateur radio equipment? And that's what they came up with. They came up with Oscar. Ham's got to name everything. Oscar's orbiting satellite carrying amateur radio. And that's what they did. It was launched into orbit. It was ejected from the spacecraft with the spring out there. It had a battery and a fixed life, and it transmitted on a certain frequency in CW the letters HI. And as the satellite went by, hams would listen to it. And that was impressive back then. It was only in orbit for about 2 months and it re-entered the atmosphere there, but that's how hams got their birth in amateur radio satellites. They were able then to try it again with Oscar 2, 3, and 4 and get a little bit more battery life and a little bit more payload. But one thing that amateurs get credit for is they pioneered the concept of a secondary or tertiary payload concepts on satellites here. And then people got thinking, you know, we could, make money on this, or we can use this to help pay for it, or we can use this as an opportunity to launch other type of payloads as well as your primary payload. Project Oscar continued, and then some hams up at the Goddard Space Center up in Washington, D.C., where it's NASA's main headquarters there. There were hams there that formed what is today called AMSAT North America. And they set that up in 1969, and they developed and launched what was called A05. There were Oscar 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then A05 there. And AMSAT, this AMSAT is still active today. That's what you hear. It's the primary mechanism for amateur radio satellites in North America, AMSAT NA. But there's all types of AMSAT organizations. There's AMSAT Germany, AMSAT Sweden, AMSAT Chile, AMSAT Japan, and they're a loose confederation of organizations that get together with other AMSAT groups to plan projects there. That's how Phase 3D satellite project became available. The Germans had contacts in AMSAT DL that were able to get on the launch of the Ariane 5, which was the European Space Agency's next booster rocket, as a secondary payload. And they got with AMSAT North America to develop a very large satellite. You saw that picture early. Most of our payloads are about the size of a beach volleyball. If you wanted to carry it, well, Phase 3D was big. It was about the size of that payball. I got some slides I'll show you a little bit later on that. So how do a bunch of hams get a satellite project put together and get it in orbit? That's quite an accomplishment. And we're up to what, AO85 and beyond right now, with 85 amateur radio satellites there. It's a function of wheeling and dealing using good old ham innovation that you've got. You see it all the time when you go to Hamfest and you see somebody take something that you've seen many times and they've got some innovative use associated with it. Give you an example of how we were able to get a payload by taking risk and doing things that you wouldn't do with a normal commercial payload because it's an amateur radio satellite there. The Canadians wanted to put a satellite in geostationary orbit to look at stars. And if you take a telescope and you look at a star for the longest time and record the light coming out of that telescope on a photosensor and record the amount of light coming off that star, over time you'll see what's called a microvariability. The brightness of that light can be predicted to a point once you collect enough information about that star. As you monitor that star, if there's a deviation in this variability of light, astronomers say you can infer that a planet going around that star has got between the star and Earth, and it blocks some of that light. So they can then infer there might be a planet orbiting around this sun there. That's the idea. The Canadians early on wanted to test that. They wanted to build a satellite, put it in geostationary orbit. Very, very expensive real estate up there in geostationary orbit, 28,000 miles above Earth and stuff. To do that, they need a satellite about the size of one of these cars out here because you have to control your spacecraft. The attitude of your spacecraft has to be in a precise area because it's very expensive real estate with other geostationary satellites. And when you get low on fuel, you bump it out and send another very expensive satellite up there. AMSAT got with the Canadians and said, why do you need to go geostationary orbit? You could put this satellite in a polar orbit around the Earth, and as it's going around the Earth, you can get your telescope and point it at that star. You can collect the data digitally, store it on your satellite, and when it's passing over Canada, you can download your data and do your analysis on your data.
About time to do wagon train.
Okay.
Wagon train.
Okay, all those in favor rise.
For AO85, typically you can have an HT sit here and listen to it with just a rubber ducky antenna. And to make it easier to be able to reach it, obviously a directional antenna is best. A couple things to be concerned with when you're doing any kind of communications on satellites, being able to vary the polarity. By being able to do that, then you get your best signal, because the satellite is kind of tossing and tumbling in a lot of cases. So what we're waiting on now is it should come from the northwest to move to the southeast. So it'll be on to the right or to the left of us. Okay. You have to make sure that you stay away from trees and things that are going to cause you problems. When you're talking low power, a tree will make a difference. That's one of the problems we ran out to at Tallahatchie when we did some of the work during the field day, was that we had buildings and trees and antennas and pretty much a whole bunch of different things that were causing some of the blockage.
This is an FM satellite bird, so with FM the strongest signal is going to get into the satellite and relay it here. So we're competing sometimes with some a little bit higher powered stations
Not much. VHF probably no more than probably 3 dB. No more than that.
How long of a window do you have to track? Usually 14 minutes. But typically you've got to wait for the satellite to come over the right.
Somebody published in the AMSAT journal is going to be there. And we did some past predictions and made a few contacts. I've been very fortunate. Russ has kind of helped me with some of the mentoring of the way things work. I've been able to work all states via satellite. I've probably got 350, 400 grid squares all satellite. I was number 69 on worked all states. So there's not very many people out there that do it. Mississippi is the hardest state to work. And if you are on the air, then you are going to be the guy.
All right, thanks, Frank. Well, like they say in baseball, you win a few, you lose a few, the others get rained out. But such as amateur radio, and especially when you do live demonstrations. But anyway, work on. Sure, go ahead, Eddie.
One of the strangest things I ever did was I had a GMC Suburban, one of the first ones that came out. And I had an antenna in the back. And we're talking about part of the antenna to my home station before I actually put it up. And I would take my mobile rig and hook it up. And here I am standing in the middle of the Kroger parking lot. And I got the vertical antenna on the top of my truck. And I'm sitting there listening to it on the vertical, and I'm transmitting this long, probably 20 element Yagi, targeting and talking, to different people and satellites. Just, amateur operators are kind of strange anyway. But it was always fun to do that. We had another friend, passed us now, Ralph Stevens. And Ralph was good about having VHF antenna pointing horizon. He had an opportunity to talk to Shannon Lucid on the Mir space station. I worked at Mir. We jointly worked with a school project for ARIS, which is Amateur Radio International Space Station. We jointly did that project with NASA and the ARIS group, with 10 high school students in high school. That was in April of 2001. That was an experience, being able to talk to the astronauts and that part. I did work the shuttle one time, taking in just a brief contact when they were getting ready for a school presentation somewhere, I forgot where it was. They're going over to Houston, I think, when we did it. But it's been a lot of opportunities, a lot of things that are different. One thing that Russ and I like to do when the shuttle was going up and down was being able to watch the contrail of the shuttle at re-entry. And one thing we never did get to do, we had a friend in Mexico City. Meteor scatter is non-predictable, but a contrail of space shuttle is. So if you can bounce a signal off of it from Vicksburg or Jackson to Mexico City via VHF, that would be fun. We never did get the opportunity to do it because we never had any really good passes available so we could actually see it from here.
Yes.
We had one over Natchez one time. We had one actually go down Interstate 20, coming out of El Paso around. And we had one down in Natchez.
They don't want camera operators.
We had one over New Orleans. I went over New Orleans one time. We were able to watch the city contrail. So that's what I want to add. Kind of
Sure.
like space and radio kind of all.
Exactly, yeah. Lots of good memories of Eddie and I doing that. Eddie's got more patience as an operator than I have. We were talking about the Canadian satellite MOST. You got to have a name for everything. MOST stood for Micro Variability Oscillating Star Telescope. And ANSAP was able to say, look, we've developed satellites storing forward. Before there was an email going around, a digital satellite could come by like it just did on this pass. Instead of sending a voice up, we send a digital file up to it, and when it passed over Australia, your buddy could download it. We thought we were so cool back then, and then the email came and ruined all that. But we said, look, you can take that architecture and that technology and build a space telescope this size instead of having it the size of a car in geostationary orbit, if you let us include some amateur radio equipment on it. So on the MOST telescope, we had leased lots of extra amateur stuff on the telescope, and we were able to get that up and to play with it. So those are kind of the way we try to get in there. There's all types of amateur radio satellites. They have phases associated with it. Phase 1 was the very basic generic satellite that's non-existent up in orbit now, but that came out in Project Oscar. It had a limited battery life, orbited the Earth. It was a demonstration of capabilities and us trying to understand it. Nobody had laptops back then. You had to use chart paper and graph to predict the past like we would have had similar there. Malcolm Cowan, in fact, told me he used to do that, so he still got that. Phase 2 satellites are longer life, and they're in low Earth orbit, just like the satellite that passed. AO-35 is in low Earth orbit, and it will pass over the Jackson area 4 times a day, so you have a window of opportunity of 4 passes every day to use that. Phase 3 is, Eddie mentioned AO-13. They're a very elliptical orbit where you'd have a window of about 6 hours associated with it. When we were planning out Phase 3D, we were trying to put it in an orbit that if you had fixed antennas, every 72 hours, your antennas would be pointed at the satellite, so you didn't need to use a rotator, and you'd have about a 3-hour, 4-hour window of opportunity. Such was the game plan associated with that. What's that? Yeah, exactly. And then Phase 4, which is the amateur's dream, is to put a satellite in geostationary orbit so that you could point up there and have a long-range tube there associated with that. The challenge is, well, which geostationary orbit do you put it in? Over in the Western Hemisphere or over in Europe and Asia? You know, who's going to be the first and where's it going to go? And then finally, believe it or not, there's a Phase 5, sending an amateur radio satellite out of Earth orbit into to another planet. When the Germans were proposed Phase 3D, they also identified and they wanted to build a second Phase 3D and send it to Mars. They literally had the propulsion on the spacecraft that would provide enough delta thrust to put it into orbit around Mars. And their thoughts were that they could help with the U.S. and exploration of Mars and communications and stuff. That sort of dropped off there. But there could be in her lifetime seeing amateur radio satellites going interplanetary. So, hams want to get together and build a amateur radio satellite. How do you do it? Okay, there's all different ways to do it, some better than others, but it really focuses on what mission do you want this spacecraft to have. And it's sort of a dilemma in AMSAT. You got people like Eddie and I, we love to work the satellites. You have the designers that like to build them. The designers don't want to keep building the same design. They built AO85. It's a great 2 meters up, 440 down bird. FM, it's an easy sat. You can work it and stuff. A lot of the users say, give us 3 more. And the designers say, no, when we get that new launch opportunity, I want to try something here and push the envelope there. And there's got to be a give and take on that discussion, and there's lots of that. I mentioned Phase 3D was a secondary payload in the very first launch of the Ariane 5 launch rocket. The European Space Agency had the Ariane 4. They replaced it with the Ariane 5. It sort of looked like the space shuttle. It had 2 solid rocket boosters on either side of a main liquid booster. And this right here is called the static bearing structure, and it's a container for, and you can see there's lots of different satellites put in that one, but that's what Phase 3D, that's what got AMSAT their launch on the Ariane 5, was to demonstrate. We had to design the static bearing structure, test it, and then demonstrate it with the first launch, of which Phase 3D was inserted inside that. It was the secondary payload on that. One thing, we were talking out in the parking lot, talking about circular polarization of the antenna, and if you got an uncontrolled attitude of the spacecraft, that is, the spacecraft's tumbling, your antenna is on all different gyrations as it tumbles through space. On Phase 3D, AMSAT over in Germany, they developed some magnetically levitated gyroscopes to control the attitude of the spacecraft. And they were magnetically levitated because there's fewer parts to wear out. The idea behind this was, they had the patent on it, the idea behind this was if you fly them in space, you can then get them space rated for insurance companies for putting things up in geostationary orbit. As you got satellites in geostationary orbit, they use gas thrusters to control their attitude when they start drifting. When they get low on gas, they bump it out and send another one up. If you have these magnetically levitated gyroscopes, you could control the spacecraft. And that was one of the other missions of Phase 3D, was to learn how to do that, how to manage the attitude of the aircraft, and you can extend the life of the spacecraft up in geostationary orbit. And as a ham point of view, we would say, great, then can we add this little gizmo on your geostationary satellite as you're flying this thing if you use our technology. So that's what some of the ways things get done. Okay, amateur radio, the traditional HF versus amateur radio, there's all give and takes. We saw a little bit out in the parking lot here. In the HF, you're available when the bands are open, where with satellites, it's available when you're in line of sight. If you can see the satellite, you can work it. Band openings are unpredictable. Satellites have predictable orbits. Sometimes they're not on, but range depends on the ionosphere height. Meanwhile, the satellite range depends on the satellite height. That satellite has a footprint that would cover North America. So Eddie could send a signal up to it. That satellite would take that signal on 2 meters, transpond it to 70 centimeters, and transmit it all over North America. Anybody in North America could hear that signal, 5 watts. If you can hear it, you can work it. Amateur radio satellites, we learned that today. If you can hear it, you can work it. Requires larger antennas, can be worked with little as an HT. Modes depend on band and band plans. Modes depend on satellite design. Beacons aid propagation awareness. Beacons aid monitor satellites availability. Some of the satellites have beacons where you can tune to find out, to hear the satellite, then you move to a different portion of the band on the satellite and do your thing. General better license. These days you can work satellites with the technician's license. So all pros and cons as usual.
One of the satellites is RS-15. I don't think it's operational anymore in the plane.
It was a Russian satellite, yeah.
Russian satellite, I believe it was 10 meters up and 15 down,
Yeah.
which you would think, you know, HL, but
Yeah, it worked.
right up and right down, you hear the
Yeah.
signal.
Just like anything, using satellites got their own language. I had this slide just not to be intimidated about it, but they have some various terms there. Uplink, downlink, the Doppler shift is something you need to learn. The higher the frequency, the greater the frequency shift. You hear those trains coming. Well, when you go up to 2.3 gigahertz, your Doppler shift's a lot greater than it is at 2 meters.
You're constantly tuning the receiver to hear your own signal. And as you're doing that, other people listen to your signal, you're able to communicate and discuss, continue to follow your signal and receive, not transmit.
Kepler elements are the information about a satellite that will allow you to predict when it's going to pass over Brandon. It's got all the numerical characteristics of the satellites there, and Kepler elements will go out of date from time to time, and you have to update them there. But typically, if they're less than 2 or 3 weeks old, it's pretty predictable on the pass there. One of my retirement projects is to try and link the clocks from GPS into my laptop so that I can time hack digital signals that are going out of my PC, out my antenna up to a satellite. If I can take time hacks on every bits of data there and send it up to a satellite, have it transponded and come back down to me, I can take another time hack, use the speed of light constant to figure out how far that satellite was at that bit of data there. And I think there's some value in doing that. Or I could then send it and Eddie could see it, and then I can triangulate the distance of the satellite and where Eddie is and stuff, and we can start creating our own Keplerian elements.
It makes 370.
Yeah. So anyway, that's on my list of things to do. But anyway, there's a language. Do not be intimidated by it. Some phase 2 satellites. There's AO85, a picture of AO85 that just passed over us there. They're typically between 400 and 2,000 kilometers in a polar orbit. Typically, you get 4 chances a day on its ascending node as it's coming out of the south going north, and when it's coming out of the north headed south, which was this case here, to work with the satellites. What you'll find is as you participate in these things, you'll hear regulars on there. They'll get to know you and stuff, and there's quite an interesting community on satellites there, kind of interesting there. They call them the easy satellites, and there's all various types there. There's digital satellites as well. These are the phase 3 satellites. That's phase 3D, that when it was inserted into the static bearing structure shortly before it was launched out of French Guiana. And we had bad luck with that thing. It was the amateur radio satellite project that never went away. We worked about 7 years on this thing. Finally got it in orbit, and there was a cap on the fuel propulsion system that was not removed before launch, and when they pressurized up the fuel system to fire this motor here, that fuel system ruptured because of that cap was still in place there, and it spread hydrazine all through these equipment bays behind those solar panels and everything, and that basic compound is not very good on electronics, and it's rapidly corroded a lot of the electronics, so we lost the satellite that way. But a lot of works, that's what happens. But how to work amateur radio satellites. The question is, what type of amateur radio satellite station do you want to, or what type of amateur radio satellite do you want to operate? There's traditional modes. Eddie was working mode B, which is 2 meters up. 70 centimeters back down there. There's a Mode J, which is just the reverse of that. There, that's where you work. You work in Mode J, 70 centimeters up, 2 meters down, right? Yeah. But there's all various types. Before coming out here, I was rummaging around in my old junk box and came across this. This was part of my Phase 3D satellite station. This is a down converter for a 2.4 gigahertz to convert it to 2 meters down there. I would do it at the antenna, convert that signal there, and then send that 2 meter signal down the line because I didn't want to lose all the signal on my line going down to my radio in the shack to hopefully work Phase 3D. That would be Mode S there, I think, 13 centimeters there. Anybody want to buy it? There are various types of equipment that you can purchase there. There's a couple of the type of base receivers there. The Kenwood 2000, which is a great not only VHF, UHF transceiver, but also great HF receiver, as well as the Yazoo FT847, I believe. And then there's a HT. There's all various types. Pardon me? Okay. Recommendations, start easy with an arrow antenna and an HT. It's a great way to learn whether you really want to step up. And then when you step up, just like in ham radios, you can go to a little bit to the left, to the right, center. There's all various options associated with that there.
As you grow bigger, it makes it easier.
Right. And there's the arrow antenna that you saw on demonstration there. You need a dual band, the arrow antenna. You need to know when the satellite's going to pass by. You can get that off the internet these days. There's also satellite tracking software that you can use. You need a good sense of humor, as we learned tonight. You need some patience. You just simply need some desire. Add all those together, and you're gonna be a good satellite operator. For example, be ready for the class. Plan and enjoy things, because things will happen fast. Eddie mentioned having a recorder there. What was that guy's call sign again? I got the first one, but I forgot the second one and things like that. People will have a little recorder on their phone application or something like that and record it that way. Satellite operator will adjust for Doppler shift via the downlink, from high to low frequency shift, just like a train that goes through Pelahatchie all the time. Most HTs can only adjust about 50 kilohertz segments. Let the satellite signal be your guide. I'd suggest your first time you get set up, just listen a few times as they go by. Hear the talk that's going on. It'll fascinate you just from that perspective. And then after you hear some things and hear some regulars on, pick out a target. N5JGK, Echo Mike 42, and this is K5NKR, Echo Mike 52. And you'll get some attention, especially if you're in Mississippi. They love to make satellite contacts in Mississippi. Here's some satellite tracking software here, and you can see, for example, the footprint of a satellite. It covers a significant portion of the Earth because of its altitude. Eddie mentioned ERIS, the International Space Station. We also have frequencies on the International Space Station there. Various types of things. There's voice repeaters where you can send a signal through and use the International Space Station, repeat that signal and talk to somebody else in North America. If you're lucky, you can talk to the astronauts there. I talked to a guy on the Mir when we had American presence on the Mir, and he wanted to know what the Dallas Cowboys score was that week. That was his only thing. These days they get the internet and email up there, so they're not that in dire need of things like that. He wanted to know that in the Dow Jones 500, what the Dow Jones score was. But anyway, there's all various things on the International Space Station. Lou McFadden, W5DID, who lives in Florida, has done a lot of interesting stuff with that. He's pioneered that with the ERIS team there, but from a technical point of view. There's also educational contacts there. There's a picture when the Vicksburg Amateur Radio Club, we made our contact in 2001, but they make contacts with schools around the world. They've got a great syllabus. Before the contacts, they have a syllabus that covers what the kids should expect, what they learn something about this, so when they make the contact, they know what's going on. And then if they're lucky, they have post-contacts, even to the point where sometimes the astronaut will come to the school and give them an eyeball QSO. So very cool things that they do there. We're planting a lot of good seeds when we do that there. This guy standing next to me, he's got gray hair, so he's what, probably a ham operator, right? Which he is. He's a ham. That's Owen Garrett, W5LFL, and he was the first astronaut to operate amateur radio in space on the. He was on the Skylab, but they were planning to put amateur radio on Skylab. It didn't happen, and they put it on the shuttle once the shuttle got operated. And he was on a mission there, and he was one of the few at that time hams that were astronauts there. So, I think it was. Yeah, I think it was taking a date. Yeah.
Get together. He was there.
Yeah. It's a good guy from Enid, Oklahoma, so he can't be all bad. Lots of resources. The most important resource I consider is you. You're a ham. Hams are innovative. Hams can figure these things out. Get on the internet. There's good email reflectors associated with that. Read and learn. Find an Elmer if needed. The bottom line is just do it. I mean, there's an opportunity. If Eddie and I can do it, y'all can do it as well there. And there's all opportunities associated with that. When my station was up, one of the things I could come home from work, and if I had to mow the lawn or something, I finished up the lawn, I can just go in there and turn on there, and there was always a pass within 20 minutes or so. I could get up and there was so-and-so on there, and you'd have a chat with them and stuff. It was very cool. So.
And you can also use some of these satellites when they're at their prime point. You can actually use vertical antennas. You can use 8-meter type antennas.
Yeah.
Where you don't have to worry about them kind of rotating.
There's some innovative hams out there that's designed things. This was slides in preparation for our AO demo, so I won't go on that. Some suggested contacts and finally questions there. But anyway, hope to hear you on the satellites. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What are CubeSats?
CubeSats. Okay, CubeSats to answer your question, it's a very small satellite, and they call them cubes, similar to sugar cubes or something. But the size of them is maybe 6-inch cube associated with it. A guy out of the University of Utah developed the architecture for it. You can insert various electronic cards, equipment in the CubeSat, and then surround it with solar cells, and they'll operate. A lot of the universities have taken on CubeSats as a way to give their graduate students that are studying aeronautical engineering or some actual real-world experience. They say, yes, I built a satellite, and they'll build a CubeSat problem. There's been some challenges with the use of CubeSats by university because they're what? Using amateur radio frequencies. And there's a question, if you look at the band plan set aside in 2 meters and 70 centimeters for amateur radio satellites, it's very narrow. And if you've got all these CubeSats coming out and they're uploading and downloading telemetry, what problems it's going to have if they're on AO85's frequency. In fact, years ago, I was asked to take a look at that, and I'm not that good in math to find out if satellite CubeSat over here in AO85, if they're all linking on the same frequencies, if that would cause me a problem. Given their orbits, would that cause me a problem? If so, what percent of time? So I did what Frank would do, who's a good statistician. I did a survey there. I went in and I randomly picked out time periods. I got the Kepler elements for each of the satellites. I randomly picked out time periods, and I developed a database. I picked out a time period, called it up on the satellite software, and said, how far is satellite A from satellite B? Are they both in visual range of me? I had various, I logged all that information. Then I pulled another sample, logged all that, and I was able to build a trend associated with that I couldn't mathematically do. I think my wife can, but I can't. But anyway, So anyway, to answer your question, they're a small type satellite. There is some interest in the amateur radio community on using them. Because they're small and concise, they're lightweight, that you can have a launch with multiple CubeSats in there, lots of CubeSats in there. So, but universities are using them, get involved. The concern, like I said, is they're using the ham frequencies. And as you know, ham frequencies are set aside. One of the main purpose of why we have this frequency spectrum is ham radio is for experimentation purpose and public service. Yes, sir.
Let me follow up on that and ask another question. One problem, having been at university for a long time, is imagine you get $500,000 grant to the institution to do some R&D. Oh, and I'm going to use the ham band for R&D.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly dancing close to a flame.
Yep.
Being paid to broadcast.
And well, can hams then listen to that? Are you coding your telemetry where they can and various things?
Always seen before.
Yeah. Exactly.
Follow up because I want to correct the wrong, whether it's wrong or right. I've been claiming something that Eddie did that Russ did. Now, Russ, he's too modest. Russ was the editor of the AMSAT Journal. That's kind of like being one of the leaders intellectually in a field. And so I want us to acknowledge that. But talk to us about, hey, is AMSAT something ARL does? Is that a step?
No, it's
Tell us about how this is organized.
It's a, what is it, C3 nonprofit organization.
But it's not part of it.
We're not part of ARRL, but we are engaged with ARRL, and we get a tremendous amount of support from ARRL. But it's a very small. There's one paid employee, and that's Martha.
There's another organization, TAPR.
Yeah, TAPR's related. Yeah.
And so, that's something that a lot of new hams go, why are all these different groups? Well, sometimes the league may not respond to some innovation, maybe the way some hams do it, so what do hams do?
They forge that, yeah. Central States VHF Society's been played a lot in that,
a focused organization has a clear mission, whereas one that we are the reps for amateur radio, we do battle for you, yada, yada, yada. Maybe sideband will just go away and the AMers will quit, be happy and we'll quit voting us back in the day. So that's part of for new hams, which we have a number here. In fact, where's Carl at? Carl Hiddell here just bought an air antenna at the Ham Fest. He's getting ready. He's pumped up for your talk.
All right.
So you got a
there we go. There we go. Yeah.
Madison. So, any other questions that we've got for our guests? Well, if we don't, let's stand and give these guys a
Thank you.